Hello, friend. Welcome. I'm really glad you're here. Just go ahead, get comfortable, and let yourself unwind, and let the day go, for just a little while. Almost everything the ancient world ever wrote is gone. The great libraries burned or crumbled, or were simply forgotten, and the millions of scrolls they held thinned away over the centuries to the few thousand that happened to be copied out before the rest slipped into dust, so that most of what the ancients knew and thought and loved we will never read. And we have made a kind of peace with that. It is simply how the past behaves. It fades, and we keep the little the years hand back to us, and we are grateful for it. And then there is one place where the past refused to fade. One room, in a villa above a quiet bay, where the books never left the shelves, where they are still sitting there tonight, in the dark, exactly where a Roman reader set them down one ordinary afternoon, nearly 2,000 years ago. By every rule of time, those scrolls should be long gone, and yet they are still there, and the reason they survived is the strangest and the most terrible story I know. And I think that's what has never let go of me here. Because this was never really a story about a volcano. It's a story about the strange, backwards mercy of it, that the very disaster which destroyed a town became the one reason we can still hear it speak. It's the other half of the question we all carry, not what did we lose, but what, against every odd, was somehow kept. So tonight, that's where we're going. We'll walk through a small Roman town in its last ordinary days. We'll stand beside a 17-year-old boy across the bay who watched the whole thing happen and wrote it down. And we'll follow the scrolls themselves down through the centuries into the hands of people alive right now who are reading them tonight with machines no Roman could have dreamed of. And as we go, I'll be honest with you about which parts of this story are solid ground, which parts the experts still argue about, which parts turned into legend, and why, against everything, it survived to reach us at all. So settle in, and let me take you back. On the shore of a wide blue bay in the south of Italy, a little under 2,000 years ago, there was a small and comfortable town called Herculaneum. Not a large place, 4,000 or 5,000 people, against the greater crowds of its neighbour Pompeii along the coast, but a lovely one, a town of fine houses stacked on a low headland above the sea, with painted walls and cool inner courtyards, and gardens and marble terraces where the well-off could sit in the evening and watch the light go down over the water. Behind the town rose a green mountain, gentle sloped, its lower flanks planted thick with vineyards, its summit a wild and pleasant place where, a century and a half before, a runaway gladiator named Spartacus had once camped his rebel army. No one living thought the mountain was anything but a mountain. It had been quiet for as long as there had been memory, and longer, and it was simply the green hill at the town's back, and its name was Vesuvius. Somewhere in that town, in a grand villa just outside the walls, on the seaward side, there was a room lined with shelves. And on the shelves, there were scrolls. Hundreds upon hundreds of them. Rolls of papyrus. The books of a working library. It is worth fixing that room in the mind, quietly, at the start, because everything that follows turns on it. That small library, in that villa, above that bay, is the only library to survive from the whole of the ancient world. Not a description of a library, not a memory of one, but the actual books, the actual rolls that a Roman reader once touched and set back on the shelf. They are still here. And the reason they are still here is the most terrible reason imaginable, and one of the strangest turns in the whole long story of how knowledge is lost and saved. For most of a day and a night, late in the summer or the autumn of the year 79, the Green Mountain destroyed the towns at its feet. It buried Herculaneum so deep and so completely that for 16 centuries no one knew for certain where it had stood. And in the burying, the mountain did something no one could have intended, and no one understood for a very long time. It saved the books. Almost everything the ancient world itself knew of that day comes down to us through the eyes of a single young man. He watched it from across the bay and wrote it down, many years later, in 2 letters. His name was Pliny. The historians call him Pliny the Younger, to tell him apart from his uncle, who shared the name and who would not live through the day. He was 17 years old at the time, staying with his mother and his uncle at a naval base called Misenum, across the water, some miles from the mountain. And nearly 30 years afterward, a great historian, Tacitus, wrote to him asking for the true account of how his famous uncle had died. So Pliny sat down and wrote back, not a report of a volcano, for no one yet had the word or the idea of such a thing, but the account of a death, set down, as he said, so that it might be handed on to later ages more truly. It is one of the quiet accidents of history that these 2 private letters, of a not especially important man, should have outlived almost everything else, and become the eyewitness through which the whole world has seen that day. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, was a remarkable man, a scholar and a naturalist who had written a vast encyclopedia of the whole natural world, and also, at that moment, the admiral in command of the Roman fleet stationed in the bay. On that afternoon, the young Pliny remembered, his mother pointed out a strange cloud rising from the far side of the water. It climbed into the sky on a long straight trunk and then spread out at the top into branches, and the shape of it, the uncle said, was like nothing so much as one of the great umbrella pines of Italy, a tall column opening into a wide, flat crown, white in some places, and in others dark and stained with the ash and earth it was carrying up. It is such a good description that the scientists who study these eruptions still call this kind of column, to this day, a Plinian column, after the man who first found the words for it. The uncle, being a scholar first, ordered a fast boat made ready so that he could go closer and observe the marvel. And then, as the boat was being prepared, a message reached him, a note from a woman named Rectina, whose house lay directly beneath the mountain, on the shore, with no way out except by sea, begging him to save her. And the errand changed. It stopped being about curiosity and became about rescue. He gave orders to launch the warships, the whole fleet, and he set out across the bay. And in his nephew's unforgettable phrase, he hurried toward the place from which everyone else was fleeing. What that crossing was like, the young man could only later reconstruct from those who survived it. As the ships drew near the mountain, the ash falling on them grew hotter and thicker, and then came pumice, light burned stones, and blackened fragments cracked by the fire, raining down onto the decks, and the sea itself heaved and shoaled so that the shore became almost impossible to reach. The helmsman begged to turn back, and the old admiral would not. "Fortune," he said, "favours the brave," and ordered the ship on, to the house of a friend named Pomponianus, further along the coast at Stabiae. There, cut off by a sea too wild to sail back out onto, the uncle did a thing that tells one everything about him. He behaved as though nothing were wrong. He bathed and he dined, and he was cheerful, his nephew wrote, or, and this, Pliny added, was just as great a thing, he seemed cheerful for the sake of the frightened people around him. And then he went to bed and slept, genuinely slept, so deeply and so heavily that the servants passing his door could hear his slow, loud breathing through it. They had to wake him in the end because the pumice was piling up so fast in the courtyard outside that if he had slept much longer, the door would have been sealed shut. The house was shaking. The choice was to stay under the trembling roof or to go out under the falling stones, and they chose the open air and tied pillows over their heads with cloths against the rain of pumice. A small, human, almost absurd detail. Grown men walking out into the end of the world with cushions bound to their heads. They made for the shore to see whether the sea had calmed. It had not. And there, on the beach, the old man lay down on a sailcloth spread for him and asked twice for cold water and drank it. And then a smell of sulphur and a breath of flame sent the others hurrying away and roused him. He got to his feet, leaning on two young servants, and at once he fell and did not rise. His nephew, who was a careful man, reasoned out the cause, that the thick, foul air had stopped a windpipe that had always been weak. 2 days later, when it was over, they found his body on that shore, whole and unmarked, and still clothed exactly as he had been. He looked, his nephew wrote, and hold on to this line because it is the truest thing in the whole account, and it is the key to everything the mountain did that day. He looked more like a man asleep than a man dead. Back across the bay, at Misenum, the 17-year-old Pliny was living through his own version of the same night, and his second letter tells it. He was, he admits with a kind of rueful honesty, showing off. When the earth began to shake so hard that everything seemed about to be turned over, and his mother came to beg him to flee, he made a point of staying calm. He had, he says, called for a book, a volume of the historian Livy, and had gone on reading it, and even making notes from it, as if at leisure, as though determined to prove that a cultured young man does not panic. It is such a recognizable, slightly ridiculous, entirely human thing. A teenager insisting on his own composure while a mountain buries the coast. But the composure did not last, and what he saw as the night came on he never forgot. He watched the sea draw back from the shore, sucked away so that stranded sea creatures were left flapping on the sand where the water had been, the great indrawn breath before a wave. He watched a black cloud come across the bay, torn open again and again by darting forks of fire, like lightning but larger. And the ash began to fall, and the darkness came down. Not the dark of night, he wrote, but the dark of a sealed room with the lamp put out. And in that darkness, he recorded something that reaches across 19 centuries and closes a hand around the wrist. People were calling out for one another in the black, parents for children, husbands for wives, knowing each other only by their voices. Some prayed to the gods, but more of them, he wrote, decided there were no gods any longer, anywhere, and that this night was the last night, the eternal and final night of the world, come at last. It is one of the very few places in all of Roman writing where the mask slips, and one hears ordinary people, in the dark, believing they are watching the end of everything. And then, after a while, the blackness thinned and paled and lifted. A false dawn first, and then a true one. And the sun came up wan and sickly, the way it looks in an eclipse. And the living came out and looked, and found the whole familiar world gone. The fields and the roads and the shapes of things all buried, smoothed away under a deep grey blanket of ash, as if, his image, and it is the perfect one for this show, as if under a fall of snow. It is worth pausing on how nearly we lost even this. The only other account of the eruption to come down to us from the ancient world was written more than a century later by a historian named Cassius Dio, and it is everything Pliny's letters are not, lurid and vague and full of wonders. Dio has enormous giants striding about the mountain and the countryside, figures like the giants of legend. He has a sound as of trumpets in the air. He has the ash carried clear across the sea to Africa, and to Syria, and to Egypt, and falling even on Rome. It is a good story, and almost none of it is any use. And tellingly, Dio never so much as mentions the death of Pliny the Elder. The one death we know most about is missing entirely from the grander history. That contrast is the whole reason to trust the letters. The sober, private, particular account, the pillows tied on heads, the weak windpipe, the man who looked asleep, survived and kept the truth, while the official, dramatic tradition lost it under giants and trumpets. And there is one more quiet thing the letters preserve, almost by accident. Two women hold the human center of the whole account, and neither is ever named. Not the woman whose desperate note down at the shore turned the entire fleet toward the mountain, and not Pliny's own mother, who woke him in the dark and begged him to leave her behind because she was old and slow and would not be the cause of his death. The men are named and remembered. The women who set the rescue in motion and who nearly gave their lives so a boy could run are simply a woman and my mother. It is a small, true observation about who gets written down, and it has waited 19 centuries inside the most famous letters in Rome for someone to notice it.
Now, the young man across the bay never saw what happened to Herculaneum itself, and the town's own end went unwitnessed and unwritten for 1800 years. To reconstruct it, we have had to learn to read the mountain, and the science of that is worth telling slowly, because it holds the strange, dark heart of this whole story. Herculaneum, as it happened, was spared the long rain of pumice that was steadily burying Pompeii. The wind that day carried the falling stone the other way, to the southeast onto Pompeii, while Herculaneum, upwind, stayed almost clear. For the first hours, the people of Herculaneum might have believed themselves lucky. They were not lucky. What killed Herculaneum was not the slow fall of stone. It was something faster and far more terrible. Late in the night, the towering column of the eruption, too heavy to hold itself up any longer, collapsed, and part of it came down the mountainside as a surge, a scorching avalanche of gas and ash, moving faster than a person could run, faster than a person could think. It reached the town, the scientists calculate, in perhaps 4 minutes from the moment it began its fall. There was no outrunning it. There was no time even to understand it. And here is the thing the science has found, the thing that turns this from a disaster into something stranger. By measuring the light reflected off the charcoal the eruption left behind, a technique that can read, in the very structure of burned wood, how hot the fire that made it was, researchers have put a number on that first surge. It came into Herculaneum at somewhere between about 500 and 550 degrees. It was, in the plainest terms, a cloud of heat, and it killed instantly, in the first instant, before any person in the town could take a single step in fear. That is a hard fact, and the honest telling cannot hide from it. But the same researchers found something that sits alongside it, and it is the quiet, astonishing center of everything. That searing cloud was not a fire in the ordinary sense. An ordinary fire burns things away, but to burn something away, to turn wood or paper truly to ash, takes not only heat, but time, hours of it, and air. The surge gave neither. It was over in moments, and it drove the air out as it came. And so the wood of the town, and the furniture, and the beams, and, in that one villa outside the walls, the papyrus scrolls on their shelves, did not burn. They charred. They flash-carbonized, turned in an instant to black and brittle carbon, and then, before they could do anything else, they were sealed. Because behind the heat came the rock, surge after surge, flow after flow, until Herculaneum lay not under a few feet of ash like Pompeii, but under 20 meters of solid volcanic stone, packed down and airless and dark. 20 meters of rock and no air. It is the exact recipe for keeping a thing forever. No worm could reach the scrolls down there, and no damp, and no fire, and no mold, and no careless later hand. The heat that would otherwise have destroyed them had instead frozen them, in carbon, at the last legible instant, and then the mountain had buried them past the reach of everything that erases the past. Every other library of the ancient world was lost to slow time, to rot and neglect, and the long attrition of the centuries. This one library was lost to a catastrophe so total and so sudden that it came out the other side as preservation. The disaster was the librarian. The thing that killed the town is the only reason its books still exist. That is a beautiful and a monstrous truth at once. And it would be dishonest to tell only the beautiful half, because the same heat that saved the scrolls fell on the people of the town, and their story is part of this one, and it deserves to be told with care. For 200 years after the town was found again, there was a consoling belief about them, that they had escaped. The early digging in Herculaneum turned up almost no bodies, a dozen, where Pompeii gave up more than 1,000, and from that near emptiness, people drew a hopeful conclusion. The town, they said, closer to the mountain and warned by the ash already falling on Pompeii, must have been emptied in time. Its people, unlike Pompeii's, had gotten away. And then, in 1982, that hope was quietly taken back. Digging down at last to the line of the ancient beach, archaeologists opened a row of stone chambers, boathouses, built into the wall that held up the seafront terrace. And inside them, they found the people of Herculaneum. Not a dozen, some 300 of them, crowded into those vaulted chambers along the shore, packed 10 and 12 and 20 to a room. They had not escaped at all. They had come down to the water, as people do, to be taken off by sea. And the sea had been too wild, and no boats had come, or too few, and they had gathered in the shelter of the boathouses to wait. And there, all together in the dark, waiting, the heat had found them. It came so fast that they died where they crouched, in an instant, without a struggle, without even the time to be afraid. The same instant, painless end the old admiral met on his own beach across the bay. And then the mountain had sealed them too, and kept them, exactly as they were, for 1900 years. When at last their bones were studied, gently, one by one, by a physical anthropologist who had come to read them, she said a thing that became the motto of the whole discovery: that whoever says the dead cannot speak had not met these bones, for these had a great deal to say. And they did. They told, without a single written word, the whole shape of an ordinary Roman town. There was a woman of perhaps 45, well fed and cared for all her life, her finger bones still wearing gold rings set with fine stones, and gold bracelets shaped like snakes. A woman of some family and some taste, whom the excavators came to call simply the Ring Lady. There was a man of about the same age near the overturned boat, short and worn, his back bent and his bones flattened and thickened by a lifetime of the hardest labour, very likely a slave who had spent his years at the oar or the load. There was a young woman, still carrying the small, unfinished bones of the child she had not yet born. There was a girl of 14, whose bones remembered both hard work and a season of near starvation in her infancy. And in the same crowded chamber
an infant wearing tiny earrings of gold and pearl. Rich and poor, free and enslaved, the cared for and the used up, they had all come down to the same shore and crowded into the same small rooms and met the same instant end, together, with every distinction of their lives dissolved in the dark. There is a terrible democracy in it, and also, if one lets it be, a strange gentleness, that whatever their days had been, their ending was the same, and quick, and shared, and then followed by 19 centuries of perfect stillness under the rock. One of the dead on that beach may carry a thread that ties this whole story together. Among the skeletons near the overturned boat was a fit man of 40 or 45, face down in the sand, and on him a soldier's belt worked with gold and silver, a sword and a dagger, a bag of a naval carpenter's tools, and a purse of gold coins. When he was studied again, not long ago, the archaeologist in charge suggested something quietly electrifying, that this man may have been an officer of the very fleet that Pliny the Elder launched across the bay, one of the rescuers, come to take the people off by sea, who reached the shore only to die on it beside the people he had come to save. It cannot be proven, and it should not be dressed up as proven. But it means that Pliny's letter and this beach may be two ends of one thread. The admiral who turned his warships toward the mountain, and, on the sand at Herculaneum, perhaps one of his own men, the tools still on his back, at the very edge of a rescue that had come too late. And the bones told smaller, gentler truths as well. By reading the chemistry laid down in them across a lifetime, researchers could reconstruct what these people had eaten, and found a town that lived, as one might expect on that bright coast, largely on the sea. Fish supplied around a quarter of all their protein, far more than in the Mediterranean diet of today. They found, too, a small and human difference between the men and the women. The men had eaten noticeably more of the fish, the women rather more of the grain and the eggs and the cheese. It is such an ordinary thing to know about people 2,000 years gone, what was on their table, and who ate more of what. The disaster that ended them is also, strangely, what let us sit down, in a sense, at their last meals. Not everyone in Herculaneum went down to the shore. In one building near the center of the town, a young man of about 25 was found lying face down on a wooden bed, where the heat had reached him where he lay. And inside his skull, the scientists found something almost past belief, a thing recorded nowhere else in all the study of the ancient dead. A small amount of dark, glassy material. His own brain, it appears, turned to glass. The heat, it seems, had been so intense, and the cooling after it so swift, that the soft tissue had vitrified, frozen into glass the way molten sand becomes glass, a state of preservation essentially unknown anywhere else. It is, in honesty, a contested finding. One careful scientist has said he has never seen anything like it, and is not yet sure how to read it, and wonders whether the real process was a slower baking than a flash. The exact mechanism is still argued, but the image stays with one, eerie and quiet. A mind turned to glass in an instant, and kept that way beneath the rock for 1900 years. There is even, and this is the show's honest note, a genuine argument about when all of this happened. For centuries, the date seemed settled, the 24th of August, because that is the day the manuscripts of Pliny's letter give, and Pliny is the eyewitness. But the ground has begun to disagree with the text. In the ash, the diggers keep turning up the wrong season. Autumn fruit, pomegranates and walnuts and chestnuts, jars sealed as if the grape harvest were being pressed, braziers set out and heavy clothing on the dead, as though against a chill, and a coin that looks to have been struck too late in the year for an August eruption. And scratched on a wall in charcoal, a material far too fragile to have lasted long, a workman's stray date that appears to read a day in the middle of October. So a single treasured ancient text now stands against a slowly growing heap of physical clues, and careful people have come to think the true date was more likely late in October. It is not resolved, but it is a small, perfect example of the whole spirit of these stories, that even the most famous facts have soft edges, and that the honest answer, more often than the legends admit, is that we are still not entirely sure. And there, above and around those sleeping dead, the scrolls waited too, and the story of how they were found and how they were nearly lost a second time is a long and human comedy of error, greed, and slow dawning care. Herculaneum was found again by accident, twice, by men digging for water. Early in the 1700s, a peasant sinking a well near the modern town struck worked marble far underground, and it turned out to be the top of a buried Roman theatre. And decades later, another shaft, sunk near a royal palace along the coast, punched through the ceiling of a magnificent buried room, a villa's belvedere, some 80 feet down in the dark. That villa was the one with the library. The only intact library of the ancient world came back into human reach because two different men, 40 years apart, went looking for drinking water and hit the buried past instead. What came next was, at first, closer to grave robbing than to archaeology. The first diggers, working for princes and kings who wanted beautiful things for their palaces, drove blind tunnels through the packed rock by torchlight, breathing bad air, blasting the hardest stretches with gunpowder, hunting for statues and paintings, and when they had stripped a gallery of its treasures, they filled it back in with the rubble of the next, so that the town was reburied almost as fast as it was mined. They tore paintings out of walls to frame them. They melted down the broken bronzes of 6 horses to cast a single whole one. It was a plunder, and a learned visitor of the day said as much, to the fury of the court, writing across Europe that the men in charge knew about as much of antiquity as the moon knows of the sea. But into that plunder, quietly, came one man who changed everything, and half invented a science by doing so. A Swiss engineer named Carl Weber, set to assist the treasure hunt, began, against the impatience of his masters, to do something no one had thought worth the trouble. He wrote down where things were found. He drew careful, measured plans of the buried rooms, keyed to numbered notes saying what had lain in each spot. His plan of that villa, drawn in the 1750s, is the founding document of its archaeology, and it is the only record we have of how the library and the statues actually sat in the building, because after they finished, they sealed the villa up again, and it has, to this day, essentially never been reopened to the light. The years underground in the foul air ruined Weber's health, and he died at 52, worn out by the work. It is a quiet and a fitting thing that the man who first insisted the past should be recorded rather than looted paid for it with his life, in the dark, at the very moment that archaeology was being born out of grave robbing. The scrolls themselves were very nearly thrown away as rubbish. When the diggers first came upon them, in 1752, the blackened cylinders looked so precisely like lumps of charcoal that the workmen treated them as exactly that, discarded them, and some, it is said, were even burned as fuel or used as torches before anyone understood. It was only when one of them broke and showed the faint grey ghost of writing curled inside that the truth began to dawn. The keeper of the Royal Museum wrote a letter to a colleague in London, the earliest description we have of the library's condition, and his words are heartbreaking in their plainness, that there had been found many rolls of papyrus, but turned to a kind of charcoal, so brittle that, being touched, they fell readily into ash. In the end, something like 1,100 of these carbonized scrolls were recovered, most of them from one small book-lined room. 1,100 books, from one villa, on one bad night, and it remains still the only library to come down to us intact from the classical world. Every other collection the ancients built is gone, and known only by rumour and by what happened to be copied out of it before it vanished. This one alone survived, as itself, in the original, as 1,100 fragile black cylinders that fell to ash at a touch. The scrolls were not the only treasure to come out of that villa, and one of the others has a strange, modern afterlife worth a moment. Along with the books, the tunnellers hauled up one of the greatest collections of bronze statues to survive from the ancient world, dozens of them, dancers and athletes and philosophers, a resting messenger god, a drunken reveller, figures so fine they rank among the masterpieces of antiquity. And because the Swiss engineer had recorded where each one had stood, scholars could reconstruct, on paper, the whole plan of the villa. Its gardens, its long reflecting pool, its colonnades, the statues set among them. And here is the strange part. A great museum on the coast of California, at Malibu, was built in the last century as a full-scale reconstruction of this very villa. Its rooms, its gardens, its proportions, copied from that old buried plan. So there stands today, in the bright light above the Pacific, a complete and walkable version of a house that no living person has ever fully seen, most of which is still sealed in the dark, under a mountain, in Italy. A perfect copy of a place that remains, in the original, a mystery. For a long time, the great question about those scrolls was simply whose they had been and what they held, and the answer, when it came, was both a little disappointing and quietly profound. The best guess for the villa's owner is a wealthy and powerful Roman senator of the last years of the Republic, a man connected by marriage to Julius Caesar himself. But the library within it did not belong, in spirit, to the senator. It belonged to a philosopher, a Greek named Philodemus, from a town in what is now Jordan, an Epicurean, who had come to Italy under that senator's patronage and settled near this bay, and whose own working library this seems, in large part, to have been. The books that have been read are overwhelmingly his, the specialist library of one philosopher, works on ethics and the gods, and music and poetry, and how to speak frankly to a friend, and how to face death without fear. It is not the lost masterpieces of the ancient world. It is one thoughtful man's shelves. And there is something more moving in that, in a way, than any treasure would be. The actual working books of an actual thinker, the tools of one mind, preserved by accident when all the grand libraries were lost. And at the heart of what he thought there is an idea worth carrying toward sleep. The Epicureans have a bad and unfair reputation as people who chased indulgence, but what Philodemus and his school actually valued was pleasure rightly understood. Not greed, not excess, but the quiet, sufficient, unanxious enjoyment of a life without needless fear and needless want. Pleasure rightly understood. It is a gentle philosophy to find waiting in the dark, at the bottom of a buried villa under a mountain. And among his books there was one, we know, on how to face death. And there is something almost unbearably fitting in that. The Epicureans had a teaching about death that they meant as a comfort, and that has comforted people for 2,000 years. Death, they said, is nothing to us, because while we are here, death is not yet. And when death has come, we are no longer here to meet it. The two never touch, and so there is nothing in it to be feared, no darkness to dread, only a return to the same untroubled quiet out of which we came. It is a hard teaching to hold in the broad daylight, and an easier one, perhaps, in the last soft minutes before sleep. And it was sitting there, on a shelf, in that villa, on the very day the mountain came down. A book about not fearing death,
in a house whose people were about to meet it, together, in a single instant, on the shore below. They had no time to take it down and read it that day, but it outlived them. The calm words about a calm they could not have known was rushing toward them. And it is being read now, off its sealed black roll, by people who will never know their names. There is a strange consolation in that, if one lets it come, that the gentlest thought in the whole house outlasted the catastrophe, and is among the very first things to find its way back to us now, out of the dark. But to know any of that, someone had to read the scrolls, and for 250 years, to read one of these scrolls was to destroy it. That is the tragedy folded inside the miracle. The earliest attempts were simple butchery. To get at the writing inside, they would split a roll down its length, or scrape its outer layers away, saving a few words and ruining the whole. Hundreds of scrolls were damaged or lost outright in those first crude years. And then, a patient Italian priest named Antonio Piaggio built a machine to do it more gently, and his machine is a small marvel of stubborn care. He would glue a fine backing of thin membrane onto the outer surface of a scroll and attach silk threads to its edge, and then, by the slow turning of a screw, coax the layers apart, at a rate, when it went well, of perhaps 1/10 of an inch in a day. A single scroll could take months or years. His machine opened most of the scrolls we can read at all, and it was a vast improvement on tearing them apart. And yet even his gentle screw destroyed the beginning of every scroll it touched, and often the end, and left the rolls in a ruined and crumbling state. And the best preserved scrolls of all, the densest, the most tightly wound, the ones most likely to hold whole and unbroken text, were precisely the ones no method could open, because they would shatter at the attempt. And so, hundreds of them simply sat for 2 centuries in their cases, unreadable black lumps, holding who knew what, that would crumble to nothing if a human hand tried to unroll them. That was the wall. And the 21st century, at last, found a way not to break through it, but to go around it entirely. The idea, when it came, was so simple and so strange that it took years to make it work. Stop trying to open the scrolls at all. Read them while they stay closed. The man at the center of it is a computer scientist named Brent Seales, who had spent much of his career on the problem of reading damaged and unopenable books by machine. His method is called virtual unwrapping, and the principle is this. One takes the sealed, rolled scroll and scans it with a very fine, very powerful X-ray, the kind that can map the inside of a solid object in 3 dimensions without touching it, so that, in a computer, there stands a perfect model of the coiled scroll, every wrapped layer of papyrus nested inside the next. Then software traces each buried layer through that model, follows its spiral round and round, and digitally unrolls it, flattens it out into a readable sheet on a screen without a single grain of the real scroll ever being disturbed. He proved it could be done some years ago on a different burned scroll, a charred lump of a Hebrew biblical book from the shore of the Dead Sea, as black and solid as any Herculaneum roll. And out of that lump, untouched, his team read the opening lines of the book of Leviticus. The principle worked, but Herculaneum posed one last, cruel problem. The problem was the ink. The Dead Sea Scroll had been written in an ink containing metal, which showed up bright and clear on the X-ray, easy to see against the pale page. But the ink of Herculaneum is carbon, soot and water, laid down as black writing on papyrus that the eruption had itself turned to black carbon. Carbon ink on a carbon page. To an X-ray, they are very nearly the same substance, the same density, and the writing is all but invisible, a shadow on a shadow. For years, the scans existed and the ink stayed hidden inside them, and the puzzle sat unsolved. But Seales had a further idea. The ink might not be denser than the page, but where it lay, it might have changed the surface, ever so slightly, left a faint texture, a subtle roughness where the letters had been. Too faint for a human eye to catch, but perhaps not too faint for a machine trained to look for it. And in 2019, he carried 2 of the intact, unopenable scrolls to one of the most powerful X-ray machines in the world, a great ring of a thing in the English countryside, and scanned them at the highest resolution yet, building the vast, detailed, 3-dimensional record that everything after would depend on. The data was there. The writing was in it, somewhere, as a ghost. What was needed now was a way to teach a machine to see the ghost, and for that, the effort was thrown open to the whole world. Because in 2023, rather than keep the puzzle inside one laboratory, Seales and 2 technology entrepreneurs did something clever and generous. They turned it into a contest. They released all of the scans and the software to anyone who wanted them, and they offered more than $1 million in prizes to whoever could first read the hidden writing. They called it the Vesuvius Challenge, and the effect was extraordinary. All over the world, young programmers and students and tinkerers downloaded the ghostly scans of a 2,000-year-old scroll and set their machines to hunting for the ink. The first crack came within months. A physicist, poring over the data, noticed a faint pattern in it, a fine crackle, a texture, appearing here and there across the flattened surface, in shapes that looked less like random noise and more like strokes. Where the crackle was, the ink had been. And then, a 21-year-old university student, an intern in his spare hours, trained a pattern recognition model to find that crackle and to paint back the letters wherever it appeared. And out of a sealed scroll that no human being had been able to open for 19 centuries, a whole word rose up onto his screen in ancient Greek. The word was porphyras. It means purple. The first word read from a sealed ancient book after 2,000 years, recovered not by any hand, but by a machine taught to see the faint shadow of soot, and the word it gave back was the name of a colour. In the Roman world, purple was the colour of luxury and of power, the most costly dye there was. And here it had survived, as ink, on a page about, in all likelihood, the philosophy of quiet pleasure. Purple. It is a small and a perfect thing to have come back first, out of all the words in the world. One word became a passage, and then columns of text, faster than anyone had dared hope. Within a year, a team of 3 young people, the student who had read the first word, an Egyptian doctoral student in Berlin who had sharpened the images, and a Swiss robotics student who had built the tools to trace the coiled layers, combined their work and won the grand prize for reading not a word, but real, continuous text, some 2,000 characters, columns of a genuine book, off a scroll still sealed inside its own carbon. And when the Greek scholars read what the machines had recovered, they found it was exactly what one might have hoped, a work of Epicurean philosophy, very likely by Philodemus himself, the villa's own thinker, and its subject was pleasure. The recovered lines argue, with a dry and careful wit, that a thing is not made more pleasant merely by being scarce, that we ought not to assume, any more than with food, that what is rare is automatically sweeter than what is abundant. The writer even takes a mild swipe at rival philosophers who, he says, have nothing useful to say about pleasure at all. It is not a lost gospel or a secret of the universe. It is a real man, 2,000 years dead, thinking carefully and a little mischievously about how to enjoy a life. His actual words, in his actual book, read at last off a page that no hand will ever turn, by people he could not have imagined, using tools he had no words for. A voice, thought silent forever, clearing its throat in the dark and going on with its sentence. And the reading has not stopped.
The prize was raised again and the bar set higher, to recover not a single passage, but most of a scroll. And then more scrolls after that. And teams all over the world are still at it, still training their machines on the ghostly scans, still coaxing columns of ancient Greek out of lumps of carbon that no one has opened and no one ever will. Slowly, a word and a line and a column at a time, a lost library is being read back into the world by strangers from a wreck. It is one of the very few stories of our restless age that is simply, cleanly hopeful. A thing thought gone forever, coming quietly back. And that is not the end of it, because most of the villa is still down there, still sealed, and the greatest question of all is whether to go and get the rest. The old tunnellers, it now seems, missed whole floors of the building. There are levels of that villa, with their painted walls still on them, that no one in modern times has ever entered. And the library that was found was, remember, one philosopher's specialist collection. A house that grand may well have held a second, larger library somewhere in its unopened rooms. A general library of Greek literature and, most tantalizing of all, perhaps of Latin works, lost plays and lost histories and lost poems that exist nowhere else on earth, and might exist there. There are scholars who say the possibilities stagger the imagination, and that now that the scrolls can actually be read, the case for recovering more of them has never been stronger. And there are others, careful and serious people, who say wait, that to dig is also to expose, and to expose is to begin to destroy, that the cost of excavating and then preserving such a place is immense, that the rooms already opened are under threat from water and time, and that a hasty dig could lose more than it finds. It is a genuine argument between two real goods, the hunger to know and the duty to protect, and it has not been settled, and it should not be pretended settled. The rest of the library waits, as it has waited, in the dark, and reasonable people disagree about whether to disturb its long sleep. And so we come back, at the last, to that other library, the one that stands behind this whole story like a shadow, the one this show has told of before. The great library of Alexandria was the ancient world's dream of gathering all knowledge into one place, and it is the ancient world's most famous loss. And its ending, we have seen, was not a single fire on a single night, whatever the legend says. It was slow. It faded across centuries by neglect and politics and the quiet attrition of time, dying the ordinary way that libraries die, a little at a time, until it was gone, and even the memory of where it stood grew dim. Herculaneum is the exact mirror of that, turned the other way round. Alexandria was built to last, and was lost slowly. This little library on the bay was doomed in a single afternoon, and by being doomed so suddenly, so violently, so completely, it was saved. The searing cloud that killed a town in an instant is the very thing that turned its books to imperishable carbon before they could burn. The 20 meters of rock that sealed 300 people in the dark also sealed their scrolls against every worm and damp and fire that erased every other library of the ancient world. One collection was lost gently, over ages, and is gone forever. One was destroyed in an hour and endures. Catastrophe was the librarian. And now, 19 centuries on, a colour comes back off a page that no living hand can open, read by a machine that was taught, patiently, by people of our own time, to see the faint ghost of ancient ink. The only library to survive from the whole classical world survived because it was destroyed. And we can read it, at last, only because we finally stopped trying to open it. There is a deep quiet in that thought, if one lets it settle. That some things are kept safe
Not in spite of the dark and the wait and the long silence, but because of them. That a book can wait, sealed and patient and unhurried, for 2,000 years, and still have something gentle to say when at last it is heard. The scrolls are still down there, most of them, under the green mountain in the dark, keeping their words. They are in no hurry. They have already waited so long, and there is all the time in the world. And that is where I'll leave it. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. If you are still awake, and this one stayed with you, I would be glad to know of it. A review, if you are moved to leave one. A suggestion for a story you would like told. A gentle correction, if I have gotten something wrong. But none of it is for now. It can keep until morning. There is nothing left to do. Let the room stay quiet, and let yourself rest. I will be here when you would like another.